The future of communities and indeed whole nations depend on how well they're able to prepare their young people for the future. And education is a vital key which unlocks the door to the future. For African Caribbean children, education is not unlocking the door to the future. The door to the future for African Caribbean pupils is firmly closed. This group of students is underachieving academically at alarming levels. There is a crisis concerning the education of African Caribbean boys in particular. This documentary aims to explore the key issues and put forward strategies for ensuring that African Caribbean youth have their birthright of a bright future. The lush necklace of Caribbean islands, famed for their emerald green and cobalt blue natural beauty, are the ancestral homes of nearly 500,000 people of African Caribbean descent now living in Britain. At 2002, 56% of African Caribbean communities in the UK were living in London, with 25% in the Midlands and the remaining 19% scattered throughout the UK. For a great many people in the UK, the Caribbean is no more than an exotic, faraway holiday destination. For that first wave of migrants from the Caribbean to England, and for many of the first generation born in the UK, the Caribbean was home, the place of belonging. But in fact, the Caribbean wasn't always home. The true ancestral home of African Caribbean people is Africa, a fact which many young people of African Caribbean heritage are unaware of or are in denial of, which is hardly surprising given the often negative media portrayal of things African. African Caribbean people are the descendants of African taken by force from Africa to the Caribbean in order to work as slaves in the sugarcane fields. Jamaica, as one of the better known and larger Caribbean islands, is the ancestral home of a significant number of Caribbean heritage pupils in London schools, particularly in Lambeth, Croydon, other South London boroughs, Hackney and Haringey. The fierce resistance of Jamaicans such as Paul Bogle and Nanny of the Maroons made a substantial contribution to the legal end to enslavement. Africans who escaped to the hills of Jamaica managed to preserve some of the West African languages, such as Tree, in their pure form. Marcus Garvey, who was born in Jamaica but worked internationally, was one of many African Caribbean activists who dedicated their lives to improving the post-enslavement condition for African Caribbeans. He founded the UNIA, which recruited millions worldwide and pledged itself to the creation of industries and self-help networks for Africans worldwide. The now somewhat distant pulse of Africa remains present in the speech, cultures and traditions of African Caribbean people today. The fusion of African languages with the European languages has produced a vibrant and rich range of languages unique to the Caribbean. Each Caribbean island has a unique identity which often reflects a checkered colonial past. Modern Kingston is a fairly typical Caribbean capital city, bustling with tourist activity and everyday business. Fruit of every description can be found at the busy markets, and sole traders selling their produce at the roadside is a typical feature of many Caribbean islands. Several of the islands rely heavily on tourism and the banana trade to maintain their economies. Primary schooling in the Caribbean is free and compulsory. For secondary age pupils, although there are generally no fees, parents often have to provide books. To have access to the very best schools, pupils often need to pass an entrance exam. The schools, as in most places, are a mix of the prestigious and well-resourced and those struggling to provide the basic facilities. Jamaican children in UK schools come from a range of schooling backgrounds. Some will have had full schooling in well-resourced schools, and others will have had intermittent, if any, schooling. In areas of poverty, some parents are not able to afford to buy the school uniform and books. As a result, their children attend school infrequently, if at all. White-collar and professional Jamaicans often live well, able to afford comfortable homes and affluent lifestyles. But for the mass of Jamaican people, life remains tough, and real poverty, grinding poverty in fact, is found often not very far from regions of real prosperity. It was in an attempt to escape the grinding poverty of what characterised so much of the Caribbean post-emancipation that many thousands of men and later women left their loved ones behind in the Caribbean in order to forge a new life in England. Migration to England was a particularly attractive option in the view of the fact that there were new restrictions on migration to America, that Hurricane Gilbert had devastated much of the Caribbean, and there were very high levels of unemployment. Furthermore, there were chronic shortages of staff to work in the newly established health service, and Enoch Powell, the then health minister, actively recruited for nurses in particular from the Caribbean. There were also shortages of workers for London Transport, and Charlie Gom, the then recruitment officer, also recruited directly from the Caribbean. So it was here at Tilbury Docks on the 22nd of June 1948 that the first large numbers of arrivals from the Caribbean came to England. Nearly 500 men arrived on SS Empire Windrush in search of a better life. Aspirations and expectations of a warm welcome to Mother England were high. But dreams were soon shattered when the first settlers found that landlords would shut the door in their faces and refuse to rent them rooms, when they were paid less for the same job as their white counterparts, and when racial attacks on the streets were commonplace. Harshest of all was the betrayal of the education system. Winston Best, who became the Chief Inspector of Schools for Hackney, recalls his early experiences and what he saw happening to African Caribbean youth in the schooling system back in the 1960s.
They arrived, most of them, from the Caribbean, largely Jamaica, almost shell-shocked. Mm-hmm. They would come from the Caribbean. Most of them were arriving on the weekend, Friday, and by Monday morning they were straight into the school, so they hadn't had time to acclimatize and so on. They brought with them, obviously, their Jamaican accents, or the Caribbean accents, which was very different from British accents. They also brought with them aspects of Caribbean language, which was very different in some cases from the straightforward standard English that they heard in the classrooms. An environment that was largely white, particularly in terms of the teaching profession, and the children who, the majority of whom were white, but a mixture of other ethnic groups. That took some adjustment, and it really was quite difficult for them to do that. The other problem they had was convincing the teachers that they were brighter than they appeared to be. The fact that they appeared not to understand what the teacher was saying, and the fact that the teacher couldn't understand what they were saying because of not just the language but the accent, teachers began to develop a particular kind of attitude towards these children. The result was that a number of them were assessed very early on, before they had time to settle down, and finding themselves being sent to special schools because they were being considered not to be very bright. The other interesting thing that I found was their own parents who had come before them, who would have come in the 50s and sent them for them in the Caribbean, by that time had decided that the best way of helping their children when they arrived was to encourage them to be as English as they possibly could, which meant they were told in their home to avoid identifying with any children looking like themselves or anybody looking like themselves, and to deny the fact that they were from the Caribbean.
Waveney Bushell, one of the country's very first black educational psychologists, explained why she came to England and the challenges as she saw them for African Caribbean pupils in the area of special educational needs.
They needed an understanding, that was the first thing. They needed a bipolar approach from the school. Schools didn't think at all in terms of showing a positive approach to the children. Since the children, and a lot of teachers tended to behave like this, since children weren't reacting to their teaching and producing work, the level of work, therefore the children were no good. And therefore, their attitudes to the children were very, very negative. And I think that children needed a lot of understanding and needed a show from the teachers that they cared. And those children who had gone to school in the West Indies, I'm sure they missed that when they came here. Yeah. I'm sure they missed it.
Okay, how can we develop the mathematical genius of African Caribbean youth? Well, one of the ways in which that can be done is, I think, perhaps looking at the way in which those black youth actually engage the education process. And by that I mean we need to be able to sort of show maths, science, English, whatever it is, we need to sort of develop that and link it to the interests of the students. I've got quite good evidence that one of the reasons why lots of black boys are turned off education is because we're boring them to death, and particularly in the lower part of secondary school. Yeah. And I think one of the ways in which we can change that is by making maths, science, English much more active. And what I mean by that, active, is that children do things as much as they sit down there and conceptualize theory. And so that's one way of dealing with the issue of genius. I think the other issue about genius is that it's not something that is just floating around in black youth's head. I think it's there, but what we've got to do is we've got to generate it, nurture it, and part of doing that is to make sure that our children are focused, that they've got fire in the belly,